and welcome to yet another monthly update video for Victoria 3. My name is Sanna and I'm part of the community team for Victoria, and in this video we'll be covering internal politics. First up, standard of living.
Standard of living is arguably the most important metric in Victoria 3, as it measures just how high the quality of life is of people who live in your country. It is a metric that's measured on the POPs themselves. The range is numeric from 1 to 99. Anything below 5 is considered to be starving, and POPs in that range will actually have a negative POP growth, whereas anything over 60 is considered to be wealthy beyond belief. POP growth is split up into both birth rate and death rate. Both of these will decline as the POP's standard of living increases, but the net POP growth will increase. This has some pretty interesting implications, because if you have a pretty high birth rate, but you manage to put some hospitals into place to decrease your POP's death rate, you will see a larger POP growth than you would if the population was richer. POPs understandably have opinions about their standard of living increasing or decreasing. A POP whose standard of living is decreasing will become more radical, whereas POPs whose standard of living is increasing will become more loyal, which means you will get greater leeway in what kind of laws that you would like to pass. The base value of standard of living is a POP's wealth. A POP's wealth also determines its needs, which leads to a cycle where a POP with excess income will continue to consume more and more diverse goods. The prices of those goods will increase along with demand. This in turn means that if you can keep a solid standard of living and wealth base in your country, your economy will get naturally larger. Wealth will determine the POP's base political strength, so how much influence it can wield, even not taking any laws and voting rights and things like that into account. In addition, there are certain institutions that will yield benefits only in relation to the wealth that you have accumulated, such as a private education system, for example. At the lowest wealth levels, POPs will consume only the bare necessities that they require to survive, some food and some clothes perhaps. As the POPs move into the middle class, they will start demanding various luxury items, but also intangible goods like services and transportation. For basic food, we have both grain and fish that can be consumed, whereas luxury food, you will be looking for groceries, fruit, and meat. In addition, POPs don't always make rational purchase decisions. There are obsessions and taboos that POPs may have as a result of their culture or religion that will cause them to favor certain goods over others. You as a player may choose to encourage consumption of a certain good or discourage it. If your major rival is trying to export something to you, you can choose to discourage consumption of that and put them out of business. The wealth level that POPs can afford is of course related to their profession, but is not directly connected to it. Engineers tend to make more than machinists, but an engineer working in one building might not make more than a machinist in a more successful one. This means that you could very well end up with a nation of laborers that have very high standard of living compared to the neighbors' aristocrats that are all working on dying subsistence farms.
As usual, POPs are at the center of it all, and I'll be doing what I can to make sure that those standard of living scores are soaring. Now, our next topic, political movements.
Political movements are mass movements in your country to push for or against certain laws. A political movement can have support from various places in your country, such as your POPs and your interest groups. And there are three principal types of political movements. Movements to enact is your people demanding the passage of a specific law, perhaps expanded work safety rights. A movement to preserve is your POPs pushing back against a law you are trying to pass and defend the law that it is replacing. The political movement to restore is very similar to a movement to enact, but it's about bringing back something that has been lost, perhaps restoring the monarchy after you overthrew it to make a republic. The power of a movement depends on who is supporting it and how powerful they are. A movement that's supported by a vast mass of people out in the streets clamoring for it is going to be a lot more powerful than the one that's just supported by a handful of people, no matter how well connected they are. The other important property of political movements is their radicalism. The radicalism score shows how willing the movement is to use non-peaceful methods, up to and including plotting a civil war, to force the country to accede to their demands. A movement becomes radicalized if it's supported by a lot of radical pops, perhaps because your standard of living just took a dive and now your pops are unhappy and they want change. And also, if it is supported by angry interest groups who are, for whatever reason, upset with what the government has been doing or not doing lately. Pops can also become radical as a result of being part of a political movement whose demands are being ignored. Although it is by no sure means that the political movement will be around forever, as if it's not strong enough to maintain viability, it might just fizzle out on its own. There's also an effect on pop loyalty and radicalism if you actually do what the movement wants, as of course, if pops are out there yelling for something and you just give it to them, they will become happy. And a number of the movement's supporters will become more loyalist as a result of their movement succeeding in its goals. Movements are all about which laws the movement wants or doesn't want. So of course, movements have an effect on passing legislation. A law that is backed by a powerful movement will be easier to enact, or if it's being defended, will be more difficult to replace.
Political movements do come in many shapes and forms. Now, our next topic is one of the most significant political issues of the Victorian era: slavery.
Slavery is a heavy topic, and one that we had to consider carefully how we wanted to handle in Victoria 3, since we didn't feel that it was something we could simply exclude from a game that is meant to be about every single person on planet Earth in the 19th century. What we want to represent is the institution of slavery, its underlying systems, and to show, as close to accurate as we can get it, the causes and the lives of the people who lived under, profited from, and fought against slavery. Enslaved pops are defined by their lack of freedom. They are considered to be owned by the pops that own the building where they are forced to work. Slave-owning pops derive economic benefits from using slave labor. They don't have to pay the slaves' wages. They don't have to worry about market conditions causing those pops to leave their place of work. And as they can grow quite rich from the profits from these buildings, they have a vested interest in defending slavery. These economic benefits do not usually transfer on to the country where the slave-owning pops live, as slaves do not pay taxes, and unless you have a robust tax system that is able to extract the wealth of the rich pops owning the slaves, the government isn't going to see any of the money that they are bringing in. Slavery is an incredibly violent system, and violence, of course, is going to create turmoil. Slaves aren't just going to accept being slaves, and a country that wishes to maintain its slave system is going to have to deal with the fact that there will be protests, uprisings, and of course, opposition in the form of the abolitionist movement. Abolitionism comes both in the form of interest groups that are opposed to slavery, either because it's a fundamental part of their ideology or because they're being led by an abolitionist firebrand, and abolitionist countries, such as the historical example of Britain, who might put pressure on or otherwise oppose slave regimes in other countries. With Victoria 3, we're not aiming to just represent the more well-known American system of slavery, but the fact that slavery was a worldwide practice in different forms across the entire globe. There are different stances that countries have on slavery, and changing that stance requires changing a law. Naturally, a lot of countries, especially the more industrialized ones, start the game with slavery simply being abolished and it being illegal to own other people in that country. Some other countries, such as Ottomans, have the slave trade law, which means that they can participate in the global slave trade and bring in slaves from decentralized regions in the world.
Now our next topic deals with the main geographical political unit of Victoria III, states.
When we talk about states, we're actually talking about two different concepts. There's the geographic concepts of state region, which is a set of provinces on a map that has a certain amount of resources. Within a state region, there can be one or more political units that are owned by one or more countries. For example, in the state region of Rhineland, at the game's start, there are two states, Prussian Rhineland and Bavarian Rhineland. This political unit is what you as the player interact with on a day-to-day basis. Most of the time, you'll be dealing with incorporated states. These are states that your people and your country considers to be the core parts of their territory and where their institutions have an effect. Whereas unincorporated states could be the results of expanding your frontiers or aggressively conquering territory from another nation. Should you come into possession of such a state, you can choose to incorporate it, but once that's done, you can't go back. Cultures can consider certain state regions to be their natural homelands. These homelands are easier for the country to incorporate should they come into possession of them. Another aspect of state regions is to determine the geographic conditions that might provide bonuses or maluses to the states within that state region. We call those state traits. And that could include, for example, particularly good soils that give all the states increased agricultural output, or natural harbors that improve the ability to build ships there. State regions will determine how much arable land exists there. That in turn limits the amount of farms that you can construct. It will also determine how many iron mines you can build depending on the amount of iron deposits there and whether or not you can build coffee plantations or tea plantations. Not all of these resource potentials are known at the start of the game. There might be resources that are discovered as the game progresses, for example, gold or oil, that could drastically change the economic balance in your country.
And that's states. But what might make our pops want to move in between different states? Our next topic is migration.
When we're talking about migration, what we are talking about is the movement of pops between states in Victoria III. Intermarket migration is primarily driven by economic needs. Pops will tend to move from places with a low standard of living to places with a high standard of living if they think that they can pick up a job that will improve their material conditions. Discrimination plays a part as well in migration, as pops are obviously not keen to move from places where they are enjoying full citizen rights to a place where they would become second-class citizens. Mass migrations happen as a result of widespread turmoil in a culture, which can be because that culture is being heavily discriminated against in the places they currently live, or especially if they're suffering from poor economic conditions and widespread starvation. During a mass migration, the culture will select a place in the world where they believe that they can make a new life for themselves. And large numbers of pops of that culture will begin moving to that place and the surrounding areas, such as the widespread migration of Europeans to the New World as a result of economic hardship, poor harvests, and political repression. Countries can determine how they want to interact with the migration system by setting a migration policy, perhaps looking to attract skilled workers for their factories, or wanting to maintain political control by minimizing all forms of migration, both internal and external.
And so we have reached the end of yet another monthly update video, but we'll be back with more from our devs in a month. Until then, follow us on social media and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date with everything Victoria 3.